Good afternoon, Mrs. Estes and Ms. Samant.
Good afternoon.
So my first question is for both of you. How did you get involved in the issue of child sex trafficking, or in this case, just were you Ms. Samant crime in general?
Well, so I'm the human trafficking prosecutor in this office, and the way that happened is about 3 or 4 years ago. We had our first human trafficking case. I was in the sex assault unit at the time. The way our office works is all pimping and pandering cases come to the sex assault unit. And this particular case happened to be a pimping and pandering case of a 16-year-old, which the law has changed. I think in 2016 it changed, where any pimping or pandering of a minor is considered human trafficking. So the difference being, before that it was just pimping and pandering. It wasn't considered human trafficking. And also the difference being, for an adult victim, what you need to show is something else. You need to show some force or fear or violence or duress, coercion, etc., for it to be human trafficking as opposed to just pimping and pandering. Whereas with children, our legislature has just decided that no, if you're pimping and pandering a minor, we're going to call that human trafficking. They don't have the legal capacity, the mental capacity to consent to that kind of a commercial transaction.
I see. All right, thank you. And Mrs. Estes, how did you get involved in the issue of child sex trafficking?
Oh, I was involved in an outreach movement back in 2015, where I was trying to raise awareness that the fact that this is a issue that happens here. A lot of people really think this is just an issue that happens over in foreign countries. And through that effort, I was trying to interact with a lot of agencies and organizations that were involved in the fight against human trafficking, not just sex trafficking, not just child sex trafficking, but human trafficking, which also involves labor trafficking, and met a lot of different people in the county. And one of those was the police chief of the city of San Mateo, who at that point was the head of the human trafficking committee for the Police Chiefs and Sheriffs Association. And the person who was in this position resigned, and they asked me to apply.
So I don't know if you guys know, but Pamela is the head of our human trafficking task force in San Mateo County. We have a task force. It's separate from any other law enforcement agency. But what the task force does is anytime there's a human trafficking case, again, labor or sex, child or adult, Pamela will get involved. We'll try to get resources to that individual. A lot of times the main thing is housing. Where is this person going to stay? As you guys both know, living is really expensive in the Bay Area. So they jump in and they try to help out with whatever the victim's needs might be in order to A, support them, but also B, hold the perpetrator responsible if we can.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so I guess we'll start with you, Ms. Samant. What do you see as the root problem of this whole issue of child sex trafficking?
Well, I think that the main issue is children that are growing up without having all their needs met, that are looking for satisfaction with the wrong people. Sometimes there's our drug issues, and sometimes there's just a sense of being a lost kid. Like they're not doing well in school, they're very vulnerable, they're very susceptible to an older person coming in and saying, oh, you're beautiful and you're this and that, and you can make a lot of money. That is very attractive to a lot of the young women that I've dealt with. They do come from backgrounds where they may not have a strong role model in their house, a strong male or female role model for that matter. But that has generally been my view, is that these kids are either runaways, not doing well in school, and just fall into meeting somebody who makes them feel great, makes them feel special, makes them feel like they're important, and everybody likes that.
So in a way, they've kind of fallen victim to like mental manipulation, basically.
Well, sure, absolutely. One thing that this goes across the board with pimping and pandering. The way pimps get prostitutes or women to do what they want them to do is by making them promises and making them feel like we're a team and I love you and you're doing this as much for our relationship as you are just for the green dollars. And that's one way to get people to do things that they don't necessarily want to do, is by couching it in terms of, well, if you loved me, you would do this. So it's definitely mental manipulation. It doesn't have, and that's, I think, the kind of the thrust of why we say if you're under 18 and you're being taken advantage of like this, it's human trafficking, because you're not mentally mature enough to know what's going on, to understand what's going on.
So, like, this whole image that we see, like, in movies and in TV shows where it's like this victim is, like, I don't know, kidnapped by, like,
Right.
a white van.
Right.
That's not necessarily true. It's more people, like, actually in relationships that know each other
Right.
and trust each other.
That has been my experience in this unit. And I think Pamela will say the same thing. That is kind of how, a lot of kidnapping cases work, or a lot of rape cases work. When you think of sexual assault in general, we think, we have these movies, like you said, these movie ideas of a kid is sitting at a bus stop and gets abducted or pulled into bushes. And that happens like 1% of the time. Most of the time, people are abused by people that they know and trust, right? Because those are the people that have access, and those are the people that you allow to be in that type of a situation with you, where you can get sexually molested, raped, hurt. And I would say that is true for the few cases that we've had here with child sex victims. They were in a relationship with their abusers. They were in a relationship with their pimps. And at least 2 of them that I know of were hurt because they were trying to leave, and they were kind of pulled back into it. But it wasn't a stranger situation, if that makes sense. Like, we just recently had a case that we filed where a young lady was working with, and she wasn't a child, mind you, she's an adult, but she was working with this man, and she wanted to leave, and he decided that he wasn't ready for her to leave. So he ends up getting a gun, getting a friend, and finding her and forcibly taking her back. That doesn't happen super often.
All right. Yeah, sorry. Ms. Estes, do you have anything to add on to that, where you've seen sex trafficking cases not happen where it's just, a stranger, but rather it is a trusted individual that the victim has a very close relationship with?
I agree with Alpana. I've only heard of one case in the Bay Area where somebody was actually kidnapped. Every other case I've heard of has always been in the context of a relationship. And that's what makes it so insidious, is people employ tactics that are very common in just getting to know somebody else. And that's why it's really difficult for these kids and even adults, for them to understand what's happening to them, how they're being manipulated, how they're being defrauded. It's all within the context of a relationship. And the only other thing I would mention is, you said something about, how does this happen? Well, it's just really an economic decision of supply and demand. If there weren't people willing to pay for sex with strangers, then we wouldn't have this problem. So the exploiters are greedy, and they're looking for a quick buck. They're not the ones that are having sex. They're obviously manipulating others to do it for the money. And if there was no money to it, it wouldn't happen. And if there weren't buyers with money to pay, it wouldn't happen.
I see. Yeah, so about this whole supply and demand thing, for child sex in particular, how big is it in the Bay Area? How prevalent is it?
So I think, I'm not sure I can answer your question, because
Yeah.
I'm kind of focused in here in San Mateo County. What I will say is that there are a lot of cases that I come across from Alameda County and San Francisco, which are bigger counties than we are, that are more urban, to a certain extent than we are. But I can't really give you numbers on that. But what I can tell you is that, yeah, it's very prevalent, because, as you can imagine, people aren't checking IDs when they're trying to, engage in a sexual act on a street corner or in a car. And I'm not saying that these guys are targeting children, but they don't care that the victim is a child or maybe underage.
Mhm. Yeah, Ms. Estes, do you have any, stance on how prevalent child sex trafficking is in the Bay Area today?
You can look at the Polaris Project. They are the ones that run the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and you can see some statistics there. Also, there are statistics from Department of Homeland Security and the FBI. And the FBI will typically say that the Bay Area in general is an area of high prevalence for trafficking. It's really difficult, and you have to analyze and any numbers or any statistics you see, because it's really difficult to have accurate numbers about this. Because the only people that, Alpa and I hear about are people who are actually identified. So there's no way to get numbers for people who are involved in it and never identified. So the numbers are really, really difficult. And there's also in between agencies and organizations, because of confidentiality and privacy issues, there's a lot of difficulty in exchanging information. So it's difficult to get really clear numbers and be able to deconflict those numbers between different agencies and organizations. But I agree with Alpana. San Mateo County probably doesn't have the same numbers. I know they don't have the same numbers of cases as you might see in Santa Clara and Alameda County, and even in San Francisco. You'll also see in all three of those other counties, you'll see a tremendous amount of street prostitution, or that you don't see in our county, just because of the probably size and the nature of the makeup. But it is considered by the FBI an area of high prevalence.
All
All right. Thank you so much.
Now, Ms. Samant, if you're allowed to answer this question, how many cases of child sex trafficking or human trafficking in general do you typically see and prosecute?
I would say maybe 1 to 2 a year, Pamela, with child victims. Wouldn't you agree?
With child victims, yes. I think you have 5 active cases right now in San Mateo County, including the labor trafficking case.
And I think only one of them do we have a child victim, and that's the one that resolved today, I want to say.
So with human trafficking in general, how many do you often?
Human trafficking, I'd say there's probably maybe 4 to 5 a year. And when I say that, it's not a child, it's usually a prostitute that is being either forced to or coerced to do something that she doesn't want to do, or there's some kind of violence in the pimp-prostitute relationship which converts it to human trafficking.
I see. And I don't know, but as someone who's not involved in law, sorry, Ms. Estes, that doesn't seem like much cases. Is that considered a lot, or?
No, and I think that's what Pamela's saying, is that we don't have, we only see the people that are either arrested or somehow come to our attention, right? So that number is not the true number of, obviously, of what's going on in the county. You have to remember that a lot of times the people that are the victims, even that are involved, and the survivors that are involved, have such a sense of shame or guilt about what they're doing that it's not easy for them to come forward and look for help or ask for help, right? Especially in a situation where, for example, we just got a report from a woman who said that she was trafficked sexually 14 years ago when she was a child. And she's only now reporting because she's kind of come to a place where she can talk about it, where she can be open and honest about what happened. Now, the problem with that is there's a statute of limitations for certain crimes. And we can't just go back as far as we want to prosecute those kinds of crimes. So when you say, is that, that seems low? Yeah, it is low. It's definitely lower than what's going on out there. But it's something that happens where somehow we get into the mix. So for example, this case that pled today, this girl was a runaway, and she had been reported as a runaway. Her juvenile officer was kind of pinging her, trying to locate her, and said that her cell phone was pinging at a certain address in Daly City. So Daly City Police Department goes to that address to say, hey, Is this juvenile here? They find her there. Well, what have you been doing? Nothing. Okay, so who are you living with? With this guy who happens to be an adult. And after, a few conversations, she says, yeah, well, I was selling my body. I've been doing that for a while. I used to work with the guy who was really mean to me. Now I'm working kind of with this guy. He's not my pimp, but he's a nice guy. And he holds my money and he drives me places and he makes sure I'm safe. And he helps me. And to us, that may, seem like, okay, this guy doesn't seem like such a bad guy, but that meets the elements of human trafficking because she's a child and he is assisting her and benefiting from prostitution on her end.
And it seems like she's very naive as to what is happening to her.
Oh,
right?
sure.
Yeah.
And a lot of times in these situations, people feel like they're in control and they're making a decision, right? And when you're an adult, there's actually an argument to be made for that, right? If I'm, as an adult female, saying this is what I want to do, this is how I can make money, there's an argument to be made for that. But the converse of that is we don't, just like we don't say like children can marry or children can do drugs or children can do X, Y, or Z. Children can't consent to being used in this way. Children can't sign a contract. Why is that? Because you don't have the mental capability yet. You're not mentally mature enough yet. You don't have the legal capacity.
Yeah.
So similarly, we have the same kind of a theory on sex trafficking.
Mrs. Estes, do you have anything to elaborate on like how many cases you typically see?
Sure. I wanted to just reiterate what Alpana was saying, is that the number of people that are being trafficked and even the number of people that are being divulged to us or identified by us typically do not want to press charges. If they have been able to extricate themselves from their trafficker, they just really want to move on for various reasons. Could be retaliation, could be fear that this person, even if they are sitting in jail right now, will get out, fear that their friends will come after them, because you have to remember this was in the context of a relationship. So this trafficker is going to know the victim's parents, probably if they have parents, they're going to know their family, they're going to know their friends, and they can retaliate or make threats against those people. And also because of the relationship, once the victimization stops, they may, in some ways, just not want to get the person in trouble. Because you're dealing with an emotional connection between this person, these two people, even if it's not a positive relationship. There's what is called trauma bonds. And if you want to be a trafficker, you can figure out how to do it by just going to Amazon. You can read books on this about how to exploit people, how to manipulate them emotionally, how to be friendly with them, and then become mean to them. And it's a strange psychological process of creating trauma bonds, which makes, and sometimes these people very protective of the person that trafficked them. So it's very difficult to get them to come forward for the reasons Alpana said, but also just because they want to move on with their life and they may still just have no desire to put somebody in prison.
Yeah, do you think that a part of it also has to do with like societal conformities, like trying to keep an image? Because I also am aware that a lot of the times when women come out, like in the whole Me Too movement, there is a huge amount of speculation around these women who are coming out. They're like, oh, why didn't you say this 20 years ago when this happened to you? Or even just like the whole sense of doubt, it could be having to do with patriarchal or like having to do with like men dominating the system and how, we shouldn't really trust the woman as much as the man. Like, how do you think like society as a whole like contributes to these victims having difficulty coming forward and putting forth their issues?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head with the kind of the first part of what you're talking about, where you described the Me Too movement and how people feel about coming out and talking about something that happened. And I think a lot of these girls and women that we talk to feel responsible. Like I was saying earlier, they feel like, well, I never said no and I was okay with it. And, this was a way for us to make money. And like you said, they're very naive about what's happening to them, not necessarily what they're doing. They think that they're in charge and they're in control and they're kind of doing something for themselves. but they don't see what's being done to them necessarily. So I think that is something that holds people back from coming out and saying, well, I don't want to get in front of all these people and say, oh, I'm a victim when I was a willing participant. Does that make sense? And then also, like, there are other issues involved. A lot of times these people have substance abuse problems. A lot of times these people have their own criminal history. And nobody wants that dragged out in front of a courtroom full of people, right? And so it's like Pamela was saying, it's just a lot easier to kind of move on. Like, I want to move on with my life. I don't want to hold this person responsible. And you have to understand that it's not that they necessarily trust us or like us or want to work with us or see us as rescuing them or helping them necessarily. We're still kind of the police. We're still kind of, we're still outsiders to them. So it takes a lot to overcome that initial distrust and the sense of, why should I trust you? Why would I go along with what you want me to do? You're just trying to put people away. And I don't identify with that. That is something I think we deal with a lot too. And one of the ways we get over that in our office and in our county is we spend a lot of time and effort and energy connecting with victims and kind of going and meeting them face to face and saying, hey, I'm the DA, this is Pamela, this is a victim advocate, this is the police officer, we're your team, right? We want you to know that we're kind of here to do what you want us to do. And another thing to remember is we don't force people to do things that they don't want to do. They've already been, in our opinion, forced to do things that they don't want to do. So if somebody says, I don't want to testify, I want this guy to walk away, we're not going to make them testify. We're just going to try to give them all the resources we can to help them get to a place where they feel like they can trust us and want to participate.
So if you know of the sex trafficker, but the victim doesn't want to testify,
right,
does that mean you can't prosecute the sex trafficker?
So yes and no, it can, but the thing about sex trafficking in our community, in our times, I guess, is that a lot of it is done over cell phones. And there's a lot of evidence on cell phones, tons of evidence on cell phones. We've also been able to, you can get a phone number and look up ads that have been posted on various websites where we can see pictures of girls and connect it back to a phone number and connect it back to that trafficker. So I will tell you that for the most part, even if the victim or the survivor doesn't want to cooperate with me, usually I can get around that if I have the suspect's cell phone and we've downloaded it. Because you can't get away from those words. And there's a certain terminology that's used consistently. There's also certain patterns of conversations. For example, if I were working with somebody, I would let that person know I'm at hotel room 602. And that person would be like, okay, you have 20 minutes. And then when I'm done, I'd be like, done. He's like, okay, that should be $150. Okay, and there's like that, and there's just boom, boom, boom. Those text conversations flow. And what an officer will do is say, look, I'm an expert in this field. I've talked to lots of women that have engaged in prostitution. I've looked at evidence. I've been to trainings, and I can tell you what this is. This is a pimp and a prostitute talking about how much time, what the sex act is, and where are you? Let's go. We have another date to make. So the answer to your question is yes and no. Sometimes you can and sometimes you can't. Like, for example, if I had a child and she did not want to testify, it would be harder because how do I prove that she was underage, right? And the last time I had the situation, what I did is I got grandma. I had her grandmother as a witness, and she was going to testify that, yeah, that's my granddaughter, and she was born on this day. And that's how we were going to establish what her age was. But you have to get a little creative, I guess is what I would say.
I see.
And all of this also has to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's really a lot easier to do with text messages than it is sometimes with just people talking, right? Because imagine I come in here and I tell you X, Y, and Z happened. And maybe I have some corroboration and maybe I don't. But you might sit there and wonder, well, how can I believe this person beyond a reasonable doubt? But if I were to show you text messages that are 2 weeks long, 3 weeks long, and there is no other reasonable explanation, right, for those text messages but the one that I'm presenting to you. And there's also evidence that, police officers from Redwood City were doing a sting. Call this number, and this young lady showed up. All of that together gives you proof beyond a reasonable doubt.
And this is something out of my own personal curiosity. How can you get around, say, for example, the objection of hearsay if an attorney were to raise a hearsay objection to that evidence?
To what evidence? To cell phone evidence?
The cell phone evidence, yes.
Okay. So that's why I said the defendant's cell phone, right? If we have the defendant's cell phone, we're in a much better shape because...
It's an admission by a party opponent.
Exactly. It's an admission by a party opponent, and whatever she is writing to him is context. It's not offered for the truth of the matter. It's just offered for the context for what he's writing back. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I guess this kind of leads to the next question. What else would you say goes into proving the guilt of a child sex trafficker or a human trafficker in general?
Past history. Sometimes these guys have other arrests. We can bring in those arrests. We have to go get those officers and those the other people that were involved sometimes. But that can be very helpful. For example, this man we have right now for human trafficking, it's human trafficking because he used force and fear to try to get this 21-year-old back into the life that she was trying to leave. But he has a 2016 conviction for pimping and pandering out of Orange County. So that's going to help us show a jury, like, look, this is how this guy makes money. Like, this is his job. It's not like he doesn't have a 9 to 5. This is his job. This is how he makes money. So that can help. What else helps? Photographs on phones. People often take photographs of themselves holding lots of money, holding weapons, tattoos. There's like a pimp culture, actually. They'll have a hat that has a P on it. The text messages will read daddy X, Y, and Z because that's how they've been teaching these girls to talk to them with respect. And also it's a little sexual in nature, obviously. So it's a lot of little things that kind of lead into the lifestyle of being a pimp and evidence of that lifestyle that you can find on people's electronic devices.
All right, so this question is directed to you both. Would you guys say that the justice system is effectively fighting against child sex trafficking?
I'll let Pamela answer since I've been doing so much of the talking, and then I can answer after.
I think that the justice system is doing the best it can, but you realize there's a whole lot going on before you get to the justice system. So you can't expect police officers to be on every corner and see where all of this happens, because much of it happens these days because of our cell phones and internet. Everything happens online and things happen behind closed doors. And so it's really, really difficult for law enforcement alone to be able to fight this battle. It really is a public health issue, and it really is a community issue. The more community members know what this crime is and how to understand how to see red flags, the better they can help at helping identify it. For instance, the very first case, when I got hired in 2018, the very first case that I worked on with Alpana, the police were alerted to an issue because the trafficker got upset with the woman and started hitting her outside of a coffee shop, and a community member saw it and called the police. If a community member had just looked at that and walked off, or just seen what happened and thought, oh, I'm not going to get involved in this domestic violence issue or this girlfriend-boyfriend issue, and walked off, she would have never been approached by the police. And of course, she didn't immediately disclose. It was only after about a day that she decided to disclose what was going on. But, it takes community members to get involved. And Alpana, I don't know if you were in San Mateo County when the clerk of one of the hotels had a guy come in 2 or 3 nights in a row with different girls, and she called the police. I think that was the first conviction in San Mateo County. And that was a hotel clerk. So people have to get involved, and people have to take ownership of their communities.
Yeah, I agree exactly with what Pamela is saying. Like I was telling you guys, the hard part of our job is we only see what comes to us, right? We're not out there, our eyes aren't out there seeing what's going on left and right. People that are in those positions, like hotel clerks or hotel patrons, people that can hear things, see things. Those are the people that kind of do need to get involved and bring things to our attention. Once things get to our attention, I do think that, at least in San Mateo County, we take human trafficking very seriously, especially when there are kids involved. It's, something that we put a lot of resources into. And like I was telling you, in terms of doing a one-on-one, that's not something I do or can do with all my victims or all my witnesses on any given case. But it's something that we definitely try to do with these cases, because we know that they're already coming from a position of distrust with law enforcement, or maybe dislike of law enforcement. And we have to overcome that in order to gain their trust and be able to help them. So yes and no, to the extent that we can, I do think that we do our very best. Do we think we're like controlling 90% of what's going on out there? Probably not. Because, like Pamela's telling you, none of these people come to the police. They don't call the police on their own. Somebody else is always involved in calling the police on their behalf. This woman the case I was just telling you about right now, where the guns were used to bring her back, she called her mom. She said, "Mom, I want to get away from this guy. I'm scared." And the mom ended up calling the police. So it's not like Pamela was saying earlier, people don't want to snitch. People don't want to tell the police. People aren't necessarily trying to get somebody in trouble. They're just trying to exit.
Yeah, that was what I was just gonna ask, was like, people, I bet, as a community member myself, like, if I saw another individual getting beat up or something, right, I would be scared to get involved because, one, I could get on bad terms with those people who are beating up the victim, and also there are like possibly criminal repercussions afterwards, right? If I happen to use excessive force or something like that, right? So what is something that we can do individually to help fight against child sex trafficking?
I would never advocate, physically getting involved in an altercation that's happening. Like, that's why we have 911, that's why we have cell phones, but making that phone call is important. Making sure that it's flagged, making sure that there's a report made is important, because, and sometimes what happens is a report is made, nothing happens, right? And then something else happens with another person, maybe 2 months down the line or a year down the line, and then all of a sudden now we have more corroboration to show what was happening in that first report. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's always, as a community member, I would say, it's always important to, if you see something that is unusual or strikes you as unusual, point it out. Nobody's gonna get mad at you for calling the police, and then it turns out that it was just a verbal between a husband and a wife, and there's nothing really going on there. But you never know. You never know, and that's what the police's job is to figure out what's going on. Do we need to separate these parties? What is the relationship between them? Oh, look here, she's under 18. What is she doing with this 25-year-old? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so like the whole thing or premise about like, oh, don't distract the police, they're probably doing something more important right now, isn't really true, is it?
I would say no. No,
Yeah.
absolutely not. Like, no police station is going to get upset with you for calling in any kind of a domestic violence type situation or any type of a violent or verbal argument, because you don't know how those end up. And I don't know if you guys know the stats on this, but most of the time when police officers end up shot is when they're responding to domestic violence incidents, because they're so volatile. There's lots of emotions involved. There's lots of anger. So no police agency will take domestic violence or anything close to it casually.
Now, another thing, a couple of other things I wanted to mention was, Alpana mentioned calling the police. There's also the possibility to call Child Protective Services if you're concerned about it being a child. The Child Protective Services has a 24/7 hotline, and they're always collecting information. They keep it. And just like Alpana was saying, maybe you don't have the whole picture right now, but you can call and report. They'll keep that piece of the puzzle, and then somebody else might see something different and call and report, and then they can put the picture together. It's really unfortunate, but there is a tool that most of the counties use. It's an evidence-based tool for screening children for commercial sexual exploitation. And the statistics show that it takes about 2 years for it to be confirmed. from the time there's maybe a first report that there's a possibility of a child being exploited, it may take up to 2 years for it to be confirmed, because they need multiple reports from many people, or multiple reports from the same person that's observing what's going on. And so the sooner that we can intervene, the better off that child's situation is going to be. So it just, it makes me really sad to think that a lot of children are exploited and being exploited for a period of time before it really gets raised to the level of somebody intervening. So the more intervention we have from the community as far as reporting, the better off everybody is. And the other thing I wanted to mention, this case that Alpana was talking about, I am so glad that this female had a mother to call. It's really, important as an adult that you maintain open relationships with your kids, because I'm a parent of a 22-year-old, and I have to recognize that I did not grow up in the same world that my child's growing up in. And there's just so much more out there. And as a parent, you really need to be open and keep communication open with your kids, not shaming them for making mistakes, because everybody's going to make mistakes. They're not going to make the same mistakes you are. And you always want to be able to let that person be able to call you, your child. And the same thing for teachers, for coaches, for any adult that has connections with youth. It's really important that they mentor them, that they keep that conversation open, so that these kids, when they do get in trouble, they do have somebody they feel confident to call. Because many of these kids that, some of them we don't even know about, they don't have that connection with an adult. They don't have somebody they can trust. And that's what makes them vulnerable to the traffickers in the first place, and makes it so difficult for them to get out of the situation they're in. And then the other thing I wanted to mention, we keep talking about females. We've had, most of the lawsuits that have been involved in the county have involved females, but there are boys and young men that get trafficked as well. And a lot of there's more conversation around that these days than ever before, because we realize as a movement we have made mistakes in being able to identify boys and men. It happens differently. We look at it from a girl's lens, from a young female lens. We provide services from that lens, and we're not reaching boys who've been trafficked. And there's some studies that show that boys that have been trafficked many times don't disclose for decades. And of course, as Alpana was saying, then the statute of limitations has run, and they've dealt with it on their own for so long and had to deal with such trauma on their own that it's really, really unfortunate. So I just don't want to leave boys and young men out of the equation as well, because they definitely are part of the equation.
Yeah. So Mrs. Says, as the head of the Human Trafficking Task Force, what goes into, or what resources do you pour into helping a victim who has been recovered from this process, basically?
Yeah. So it's really it really is dependent on the victim. It depends on what they need. We have some that end up needing housing. Unfortunately, in San Mateo County, the one nonprofit that had housing for female victims of trafficking closed down during the pandemic. So right now we have a contract with a housing provider over in Alameda County. And so that some of them need housing, and some of them are not from here, because one of the tactics that traffickers use to keep them off base, so to speak, is to move them out of their environment. And we have put victims back on airplanes to send them back home, because they lived states, many states away. We've some of them have come to us with only one pair of clothing. So we've been able to provide them with shoes and clothing, bags. Many of them I provide luggage to, because they don't have enough luggage to carry their belongings when they get some belongings. We try to provide them with, obviously, with food and whatever it is they need. We do our best to try to provide what they need. There are service providers in our area that will help. We also have service providers in other counties that will help. and I will just get on the phone and start making calls to try to figure out exactly what it is they need. We've had some that have had spoken different languages, so we've needed to try to find resources for them to speak in their own language. And so it's not always easy to meet their needs, but knock on wood, so far I think we've done a pretty good job.
All right. Now, what are some solutions to help fight against child sex trafficking, and why? Or just human trafficking as a whole?
Well, I think what Pamela was saying about educating the community, educating people to what they should look for. I don't know if you guys have seen the posters that we have up in a lot of San Mateo County, and it's not really sex trafficking or child trafficking, but it's about human trafficking. We're talking about labor trafficking for the most part. But it's about getting people to invest in their communities and take, responsibility for the vulnerable members of their communities and what's going on with them. So I would say that that's kind of the crux of it. The police can only do so much, and the police throw out a net, and sometimes you get a fish or two. But in order to really make a dent in these types of crimes, you need people to not tolerate it in their neighborhoods, not tolerate it at work, not tolerate it in their environment, and that would be the best way to do it. But like you guys said, there are problems with that. A lot of times people will make that initial phone call to the police and say, "Hey, I want to be anonymous." Well, now what do you do, right? Or say, "Hey, I did my job. I called you guys. I'm not coming to court. I'm not testifying as to what I saw. I don't want to take on these people and get on their bad side." Now what do you do, right? So there's things to think about on both sides, but that's kind of what we need. We need people to not only get involved but stay involved until somebody is convicted and held responsible.
I see. And this is again out of personal curiosity, but you mentioned that the police can only do so much. Do you feel like the police might be responding to too much, just in general? Our police stations are busy. Police officers are busy. Everybody's understaffed these days. Yeah. Do people have too much to do? Absolutely. But do I think that they take these kind of cases lightly or sweep them under the rug? No, absolutely not. I think that these are taken very seriously by all of the agencies in our county. But again, it's hard to investigate something until it comes to your attention. And these are the one way that our police agencies go about trying to locate these victims is by setting up sting operations. And what that means is you'll have a hotel room and you'll have an officer with a cell phone, a burner phone, and he's texting numbers online, because a lot of times the victims are posted online with photographs and a phone number saying, "Hey, I'm in Redwood City for a few nights, if you want to get together." So the police officers will make a date, what's called a date, and then when the person shows up, they'll arrest usually the female. And again, I want to reiterate what Pamela said. Of course, there are men and boys that are being trafficked and victimized. We just really don't see it because they don't come forward. And what Pamela said about boys that are trafficked not coming forward for decades, that's true of all boys that are sexually abused or sexually assaulted. The science just shows that they're not ready to talk about it until they're usually in their 40s. Now on the sexual assault end, the law has changed a lot, because now there is no statute of limitations if you were a child when you were sexually abused. Not so much on the human trafficking end. But coming back to what happens in a sting, now when the prostitute's in the room, she does get arrested, but the goal is not to catch the prostitutes in these stings. The goal is to catch whoever is behind them, whoever's pimping and pandering them. And that's usually what we're aiming for, is to see who dropped that person off. Where did that car go? Where is that person right now? But as you can imagine, that's a tedious, laborious process, and that's the one person that you're finding, right? What about all the other interactions that are happening out there on the internet in our county? You're not getting those. The police aren't getting involved with those.
So when the police looks at the internet, do they have access to track, or do they have the ability to track down evidence of these human trafficking cases?
So they don't know if they're looking at human trafficking versus pimping and pandering at that end, right? At that stage, you see an ad, right? And you have no idea if this is a adult woman and an adult man that have a professional relationship where she provides the sex services and he provides the security? Or is this human trafficking? Is she being either forced, coerced, or threatened to do these acts? Or if she's a child? You don't know any of that. And that's why you set up that date to get more information. A lot of times what we'll do is we'll look for photographs of girls that look particularly young. But that's neither here nor there. Sometimes like they turn out to be over 18. They just happen to look young. There's not much difference between 17 and 18, right? But that is one way to try to get into child trafficking, is to kind of focus on the ads where the girls look a lot younger. But it's not 100%.
All right, and Mrs. says you have, or Mrs. S says you have anything to elaborate on for some solutions to help fight against child sex trafficking.
Right. So I just want to step back even further and just talk about education about healthy relationships, and have you guys not look at human trafficking as this solitary crime that happens in a silo over by itself. We need to look at violent crime in general, and human trafficking is just on the spectrum of violent crime. You're probably not going to find any victims of human trafficking that were also not abused, neglected, sexually abused, physically abused at some point in their life, because it's just a matter of it's on a spectrum of all these other violent crimes. And so if we can go back to, taking care of kids, making sure they understand what healthy relationships are, because so many, like I said, we talked earlier about the fact that this is all done in the context of a relationship, helping people understand what a healthy relationship is. And then also just the whole culture of, why is it acceptable for people to go buy sex from strangers? Going back to the supply demand, why is that acceptable as a society for that to happen?
All right, and finally, are there, I know you've referenced the Polaris Project, but are there any other resources we could potentially look at to get more knowledge on child sex trafficking? Or
there's another organization called Shared Hope International that just focuses on domestic sex trafficking of children. You'll find a lot of great resources there. I mentioned the Polaris Project, which is the organization that runs the National Human Trafficking Hotline. Another one is the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. I think their website is NCMEC NECMEC. They have a great section on child sex trafficking. So that's probably, and those may lead you to some other sources, but those are very trusted resources around that topic.
The only other group I would mention in this area is Truth at Last is a law firm that the lawyers actually represent the victims. So you might get a different perspective from talking to them than you would from me necessarily. As far as, what their concerns are, what the victims' concerns are, or what kind of motivates them, what makes them tick. It might be a great good for you to talk to.
all right.
Yeah. Alpana, it's Justice at Last. I couldn't hear what you said.
Justice at Last, yeah.
Justice at Last. Yeah. And that's one of the things we haven't talked about, but just being victim centered. And that's what Alpana has been saying when she was saying we don't force people to testify, is being victim centered and letting the victim identify what is justice on their terms. And as Alpana was saying, they've been manipulated and coerced by this other person. We don't want to then put ourselves in a position of manipulating or coercing them. So we give them a lot of time and a lot of patience to make up their mind about what it is that they want to do, what makes them feel whole.
All right.
Okay. Well, yeah. I think that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah. We've filled out all our questions and more. Yeah. So yeah, thank you, Miss Samant. Thank you, Miss Estes. Yeah, and again, we would love to, extend our thanks to you guys for being, an active member of fighting against such a terrible practice in today's society. So yeah, if you guys have any closing statements or anything you guys would like to leave us with, please go on right ahead.
I can't think of anything in particular, but I will send you a flyer. We're doing the third of a 3-part film series on April 14th, which is showing a film called Boys Documentary that is about the sex trafficking of boys. And this could be followed up by a panel discussion. It's a virtual event. So you can register for it on Eventbrite if you're interested, or just sharing that information with the other people in your school. That would be great.
It's really nice to see kids of your, age getting impassioned about something like this, which, probably doesn't really affect you. I would imagine you guys are private school boys. I would imagine that it's not, your cohort is not the type of people that we're talking about that are dealing with substance abuse or emotional abuse to the extent that they get involved with this. So it's really nice to see that you guys are taking an interest in this and that you're trying to help educate your community, because like we keep reiterating, that's what it's all about, is getting the community invested, interested, and educated about what's happening.
All right. Okay. Thank you guys so
Thank
much.
you.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Pamela.
Yeah.